Greetings and salutations, YouTube. This is Fragments of Memory once again. You might know me better as the Armchair Philosopher. I was looking at a segment on Jay Leno with a gentleman by the name of Louis C.K. He's a comic, a stand up comic. Very funny white dude. Anyway, he talked about how if you're black, you have more to complain about. Like if you're a white person, you don't have as much to complain about as a black person. And then he just goes into this whole spiel. And one of the things he says is, you know, how white people like to gloss over slavery. And he talked about how white people white people like to make slavery be 100 years away from what it originally was. Now, though slavery may have lasted for 400 years in America, chattel slavery in America, well, a lot of white people say slavery was 200 years ago. Slavery was 400 years ago. And in reality, he pointed out that slavery's only been over 140 years. So that means that means that's two generations that could, that's two generations that still remember slavery. That's like two 70-year-old women who died back to back, who lived life and died back to back. Um, and then he pointed out that things were not great for blacks after slavery. And the one thing I remember was he says you can't deny a people their historical context. And just as the Irishman talks about what the Irish went through when they first came to this country, the Italians, or the Jews during the Holocaust. A lot of white people like to say black people get over it, or black people, it wasn't on me, it wasn't my fault, I wasn't there. True enough, it wasn't there, but realize that if, number one, if we're going to talk shelf life, let's not talk about the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Let's not talk about the Revolutionary War. Let's not talk about William Shakespeare, because if we're going to speak merely on shelf life, those guys have definitely outlived their shelf life. Don't talk to me about Jesus dying on the cross for the sins of the world if you believe in that Christian theology, because that happened so long ago. So don't talk to me about any of that if we're speaking only on shelf life, because you cannot deny a person the historical context. And I mean, after slavery, you had the whole Reconstruction, you had the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, you had Jim Crow laws, segregation, and mind you, what's interesting is that my father was born in the early mid 1940s, early to mid 1940s. So my father was a man that grew up in the time of segregation and slavery, not slavery, but segregation. My mother was born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s. So my mother grew up in that time period. So a lot of people like to say slavery and segregation was so long ago, but realize that my parents, I'm 31, my parents lived through that stuff. And many people in my age group's parents lived through that stuff. So I find it funny that many people would try to deny that this kind of stuff happened, or that it was just a sort of fluke, or, and I don't want to say fluke because I'm rambling, but that this happened so long ago. Well, no, really, we're just we're like maybe maybe 7 generations out of that slavery. I mean, it happened a century ago, but still, my parents were alive long enough to know about segregation. In fact, there is a gentleman I know who I respect very highly. There's a gentleman I respect that one time he was a religious and spiritual mentor. He grew up when he grew up at a time where they were openly racist. In fact, I remember he was a man that fought in the United States military. And then when he came home, he tried to rent a room at the YMCA. And he called them up and they said, hey, they had a room for him. But when he got there, the guy goes, hey, I knew you. I know you. You're the guy on the phone. And he says, you didn't tell me you was colored. And they didn't let him stay there because he was a black man. So here he was, a colored, and couldn't get in. And mind you, he told me this story in around 2002, 2003, maybe 2001. And mind you, this is when he was a young man in the military. And mind you, this man is still alive. So I find it funny and disingenuous on the part of anyone to say that those historical things, people need to quote unquote get over it. So I've been in them situations. Now, I myself have not, but we're only a few generations far removed from that stuff. Maybe I wasn't locked up in shackles. And maybe my parents weren't, and maybe my grandparents weren't. But there are those who did. You know, my great grandfather, you know, I remember him going through segregation. Some of my older cousins that were in my family have gone through segregation, and they grew up in those time periods. So we're not that far away. I mean, he makes a very good point. We are not that far away from Jim Crow segregation. We still jumping over hurdles, and I just find it interesting. And I make my point on this vlog just because I don't get these black conservatives who try to say that we are all colorblind and that we've made these great strides. We've made these great strides, but we're not that far away, you know? We're not that far away from it. We're going to need a few more generations to get far from it. I mean, even today, there's still things like racial profiling. There's still things like racial tensions. So the Ann Coulters and the Michelle Malkins and the Star Parkers just basically need to sit down and shut up personally. Just because I don't know what history books y'all been reading, but we're not that far away. We're totally not that far from Jim Crow, segregation, or at least my generation is not that far. Maybe future generations will be, but we're not that far. My parents were born in a generation where that stuff was going on for real, for real. Stuff we're reading about in the history books, that junk happened for real. And I know I have parents and cousins that were older that lived through that stuff. Well, that's just my 2 cents on the subject. Thank you for tuning in.